All right, let's kick off another deep dive. Today, we're taking a look at a pretty big topic.
Definitely a big one.
Yeah, how aging populations are actually reshaping global power,
Huge implications.
especially in the Indo-Pacific region.
Right.
You know, you guys shared this incredible YouTube video featuring Professor Andrew L. Oros,
Yeah.
and let me tell you, his insights are mind-blowing. I mean,
He brings up some really, really important points,
Mhm.
points that people just don't think about.
mm-hmm.
You know, it's easy to get caught up in all the daily news and everything, but
Yeah.
these long-term demographic trends,
Yeah.
these have the potential to, like, completely redraw the geopolitical map as we know it.
Absolutely. And you know what? It all starts with this massive demographic shift.
Right.
We all know, I mean, we've heard it, the 20th century was a time of like crazy population growth.
Exponentially, yeah.
Right. But now, here we are in the 21st century, and things are going in reverse,
Yeah.
especially in the Indo-Pacific. What's driving this change?
Well, I think the biggest driver is declining fertility rates.
Makes sense.
I mean, it's really as simple as that.
Yeah.
A lot of countries are falling below this key level called the replacement level,
Yeah.
which is 2.1 children per couple.
Right.
And when you fall below that, you start to see shrinking populations.
Of course.
And that's what's happening in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Russia, and even China.
Wow. You know, it's wild to think about China, right? A
Yeah,
country
right.
that we always think of, humongous population.
Right.
But they're facing population decline too.
It's pretty incredible. I mean, it really does make you wonder what happens to a country that was traditionally known for its manpower
Yeah.
when it starts to actually lose people.
Right.
It really does kind of challenge conventional thinking about power.
Absolutely.
And Professor Oros pointed to South Korea
Mm.
and their military,
Yeah.
which, they rely on mandatory conscription. They're facing a real recruitment crisis right now. The number of young men eligible for service
Yeah.
has plummeted. And I mean, that has massive implications for their defense capabilities.
Right. Imagine trying to maintain a strong military when your potential pool of soldiers is shrinking every year. It's almost like a slow motion security crisis.
Yeah, it's really is. And this isn't limited to just the military.
Right.
I mean, think about the broader economic and social impacts.
Oh, of course.
You need a workforce to drive economic growth,
Mm-hmm.
to support those social programs, to care for an aging population. When your population starts to shrink, it puts a strain on all these different systems.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Okay, so we have shrinking populations, but then Professor Oros kind of throws out this term, super aged society.
Right.
What does that even mean? And should we be worried?
So he uses that term to describe societies where over 20% of the population is 65 or older.
Wow.
Japan was actually the first country to hit that mark
Yeah.
back in 2005. And now they're 30%. It really is a preview of what's coming for a lot of other countries.
30%. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah.
Does that mean that countries are on the verge of collapse or?
That's a really common misconception.
Yeah.
And Professor Oros addresses that head on. It's tempting to look at these aging populations and see them as a death knell.
Yeah.
But his argument is that demographics aren't destiny. Countries are finding ways to adapt, and some are even turning this challenge into an opportunity.
Okay, that's interesting. Give us some examples. How are they rewriting the rules of the game?
So, for one, they're investing heavily in technology,
Okay.
robotics,
Hmm.
AI automation. Think of it that way.
Right.
Japan and South Korea are really at the forefront of this.
Of course. Yeah.
They're finding ways to do more with less manpower,
Right.
and they're literally designing the future of work. Self-driving cars,
Yeah.
robots that can assist with elder care. I mean, it's remarkable what they're doing.
It is fascinating, like taking what seems like a disadvantage and turning it into a technological edge.
Yeah,
Like, okay, we have fewer workers, but let's make those workers 10 times more productive.
absolutely. But Professor Oros cautions that technology is a double-edged sword, right?
Right.
It can help solve some problems, but it can also create new ones.
Yeah.
And he refers to this as the aging security dilemma.
Okay, now you've got my attention. Break this down for me. What's the downside of all this fancy tech?
What he's essentially arguing is, as countries race to develop and deploy these advanced technologies, it creates a whole new set of uncertainties and risks.
Makes sense.
So, for instance, cyber warfare becomes a much bigger threat
Oh, sure.
when you're so reliant on interconnected systems,
Of course.
and it takes a highly skilled workforce to defend against those attacks.
You're not going to retrain a retiring factory worker into a cybersecurity expert, right? I mean, there seems like there's a mismatch between the skills needed for this new technological landscape and the skills of an aging workforce.
Yeah, that's a key part of this dilemma. Countries are investing heavily in this cutting-edge tech, but they need to also invest in education, in
Right.
training,
Of course.
uh, to make sure they have the workforce to support it. It's not just about, robots and algorithms.
Right.
It's about the people who design, build, maintain, and defend these systems.
So it's not as simple as just throwing money at the problem and buying a bunch of robots. You need a longer-term strategy,
Yeah.
one that addresses both the technological and human aspects of this whole demographic shift.
Absolutely. And that's where things start to get really interesting because it's not just about domestic policies.
Right.
It's about how these aging powers are interacting on the global stage.
And welcome back to our deep dive into aging powers and security. In the Indo-Pacific, we just left off talking about how countries are dealing with this aging security dilemma.
Yeah, it's a real balancing act.
Oh, absolutely.
But it sounds like there's more to the story than just, robots and algorithms.
Right. What other strategies are countries using to adapt to these demographic shifts?
Professor Oros highlighted how this is actually pushing countries toward more multilateral cooperation.
Okay.
It's like they're realizing they can't solve these complex challenges on their own.
It's kind of like, we talked about earlier, those new alliances, the Quad, EU-US.
Exactly.
It seems like those partnerships are becoming more and more crucial in this evolving landscape.
I think they really represent a recognition that in a world grappling with things like pandemics,
Yeah.
cyber attacks, climate change, no single country can go it alone.
Right.
It's about pooling resources, sharing intelligence, and coordinating strategies to address these threats that, quite frankly, just don't respect borders.
Right. So what's driving this push for more multilateralism? Is it purely out of necessity, or are there, I don't know, other benefits to these partnerships?
Well, I mean, necessity is definitely a factor. I mean,
Check.
you can't build a wall to keep out a virus or a hacker. But it's also about realizing that collaboration can really amplify a country's strengths
Okay.
and
Yeah.
help them achieve goals they just couldn't reach on their own.
It's kind of like, hey, we're all in this together, so let's work together and make the most of it.
Right, exactly.
But honestly, coordinating between all these different countries with different interests and priorities,
Yeah.
doesn't that just sound like a logistical nightmare?
It definitely presents its own set of challenges.
I
And Professor Oros acknowledges that these partnerships can be tricky to navigate.
Here.
There will always be disagreements, competing priorities, the potential for miscommunication, mistrust. It's a bit like herding cats at times.
I can imagine. So if these alliances are so tricky, what are the keys to making them work? How do you ensure that everyone is pulling in the same direction?
Professor Oros emphasized the importance of strong leadership
Okay.
and a shared commitment to clear goals.
Makes sense.
It's also crucial to have open communication,
Right.
transparency,
Right.
a willingness to compromise.
Yeah.
It really boils down to building trust. I mean, that's essential for any successful partnership, whether it's between people or nations.
Yeah, trust. That makes sense. I mean, it's not something you can force overnight.
Right.
It takes time, consistent effort, a demonstrated willingness to follow through on those commitments.
Absolutely. And speaking of trust, or perhaps the lack thereof,
Okay.
Professor Oros brought up the rise of something called gray zone conflicts. It's this really fascinating concept that's becoming increasingly relevant in today's world.
Gray zone conflicts. That's a term that needs some unpacking for sure.
Sure.
I mean, I think most people understand what a traditional war looks like, but what exactly are these gray zone conflicts?
Think of them as operating in this space between peace and war. It's a way for countries to compete for influence and achieve their goals without actually resorting to full-blown military action. It's about using tactics that are often ambiguous, difficult to counter.
So it's like a form of shadow warfare where the lines are kind of blurred and the rules are constantly shifting.
Exactly.
Okay. So what kind of tactics are we talking about here?
Yeah.
Give us some concrete examples.
Sure. So cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns,
Okay.
economic coercion, even the use of paramilitary forces or proxies. These are all tools that can be employed in these gray zone conflicts.
So, like, take, for instance, China's activities in the South China Sea.
Right.
They're asserting territorial claims,
Right.
building those artificial islands, deploying Coast Guard vessels,
Right.
all without actually triggering a full-scale military response from their rivals.
Exactly.
That's a perfect example. It's assertive, it's disruptive, but it doesn't quite cross the line into traditional warfare.
Right. And that's what makes these gray zone conflicts so challenging to counter. It requires a different kind of thinking, a move away from those traditional military doctrines and strategies.
So how do you fight an enemy that's constantly operating in the shadows,
Right.
using tactics that are hard to define and even harder to prove?
It requires a really, really multifaceted approach
Okay.
that combines diplomacy, economic leverage, information warfare.
Okay.
It's about exposing their tactics, building international pressure,
Gotcha.
and developing deterrent measures.
It sounds like it requires a whole new playbook, just a recognition that the old rules of engagement don't apply in this gray zone.
Precisely. And this brings us right back to the importance of those multilateral partnerships we were talking about. It's much harder for any one country to effectively counter these tactics alone.
So these alliances aren't just about traditional military cooperation. They're about building a collective defense against these more subtle and ambiguous threats.
I think that's exactly right.
And welcome back to the final part of our deep dive on aging powers and security in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground, from those shrinking populations
Yeah.
and the technological advancements to those shifting alliances and the rise of those shadowy gray zone conflicts.
Right. But
But there's this one big question that we still need to tackle.
right. The one Professor Oros left us with.
Right.
How countries with growing populations like India and those in Southeast Asia, how are they going to factor into this changing security landscape?
Right. It really does. It flips the script on everything we've talked about so far.
It really does, yeah.
We've been talking about aging populations and the challenges they face, but now we're kind of shifting gears and looking at countries that are experiencing the opposite,
Right.
what's often called a youth bulge.
Right.
What does that mean for their future?
Yeah.
And how will it impact the balance of power in the region?
Well, I think it's important to remember that demographics are a double-edged sword.
Okay.
You know, while aging populations face certain challenges, growing populations come with their own sets of opportunities and potential problems.
Okay, so let's unpack this. What are some of the key considerations when we think about countries with these, booming populations, particularly in the context of the Indo-Pacific?
Well, I mean, the most obvious factor is the economic potential.
Right, of course.
A larger workforce can drive significant economic growth, boosting a country's overall power and influence. But it's not as simple as just having more people. You need to create jobs, invest in education and infrastructure, and ensure that this growing workforce is equipped with the skills to thrive in this rapidly changing global economy.
That makes sense. I mean, a large unskilled workforce might not be as advantageous as a smaller, highly skilled workforce. It's about quality as much as quantity, right?
Exactly.
But what about the security implications? I imagine a larger population also translates to a larger pool of potential recruits for the military.
You're right. A growing population can significantly impact the country's military capabilities.
Yeah.
But as we discussed earlier, raw numbers don't tell the whole story. It's not just about having more soldiers.
Right.
It's about having a well-trained, well-equipped, well-led military, one that's strategically aligned with national interests.
It's not just about throwing bodies at a problem.
Right, exactly.
You need a clear strategy, investment in training, technology, and effective leadership to make a military force truly potent.
Yeah, and you also have to consider how a country's military integrates into the broader regional and global security architecture.
Right.
Will they be seen as a stabilizing force or a potential threat? Will they cooperate with existing powers, or will they challenge the status quo?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's not just about military strength in isolation. It's about how that strength is perceived.
Right.
and how it's wielded on this in this complex geopolitical landscape.
Exactly. And we're already seeing these dynamics play out
Yeah.
in the Indo-Pacific
Right.
as countries like India and Indonesia, you know,
Right.
experience this rapid economic growth. They expand their military capabilities.
Yeah.
They're becoming much more assertive on the world stage.
Professor Oros mentioned that the Indo-Pacific is becoming more multipolar,
Right.
with multiple centers of power emerging. Do you think these countries with these growing populations will contribute to that trend?
I think absolutely. As their economies grow,
Yeah.
as their militaries become more powerful, they'll they'll have a lot more leverage in regional and global affairs.
Right.
They'll be able to shape the rules of the game, pursue their interests more assertively, and potentially even challenge the dominance of traditional powers.
It sounds like, I mean, are we on the cusp of a major power shift here?
It really seems like it.
I mean, is this multipolar world a good thing? Will it lead to greater stability and cooperation, or will it just create more competition and conflict?
I mean, that's the billion-dollar question, and there's really no easy answer.
Yeah.
And it really depends on a multitude of factors, from the choices these emerging powers make
Right.
to the way existing powers respond to this shifting balance of power.
So there's a lot of uncertainty about how this is all going to play out.
Oh, absolutely.
It sounds like we're in for a wild ride over the next few decades.
Yeah,
But what are some key takeaways from this deep dive?
sure.
What should our listeners be thinking about as they're processing all this information?
I think the biggest takeaway is that demographics matter,
Yeah.
you know, whether it's an aging population or a youth bulge. Population trends have these profound implications for everything, from economics and security to social welfare and international relations. They shape the balance of power. They
Yep.
influence the course of conflict and even drive technological innovation.
They're not just abstract numbers on a chart.
Right.
They represent real people,
Right.
real challenges, real opportunities.
Absolutely.
And understanding these trends is crucial for navigating this increasingly complex
Yeah.
and interconnected world that we live in.
Exactly. And another key takeaway is that the world is changing. And the Indo-Pacific is really at the forefront of that change. We're witnessing a shift in the balance of power,
Uh-huh.
the emergence of these new security threats,
Yeah.
and the rise of these new forms of cooperation.
It's a dynamic and unpredictable landscape,
Yeah.
full of both opportunities and risks.
It really is.
Navigating this new reality is going to require, some strategic thinking, adaptability, a willingness to embrace change. I think Professor Oros definitely challenged a lot of our assumptions and gave us a lot to think about.
You did.
And he reminded us that the future isn't predetermined.
Right.
It's shaped by the choices we make, both individually and collectively.
So to our listener, we leave you with this final thought. How do you see these demographic trends playing out in the Indo-Pacific and beyond?
Yeah.
And what role do you think you can play in shaping this future?
That's it for a deep dive into aging powers and security in the Indo-Pacific. We hope you found this exploration insightful and maybe even a bit thought-provoking.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.